If you're enjoying this tale from the Old West, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of gunfighters, outlaws, and frontier justice. Your support keeps these legendary tales alive for future generations to discover and enjoy. The desert sun hung mercilessly over the small town of Redemption Valley in the summer of 1873. Dust devils danced between the weathered wooden buildings as the afternoon heat shimmered off the main street like ghostly apparitions. It was the kind of day when even the rattlesnakes sought shade. Jack Morrison had ridden into town 3 days earlier, his black stallion's hooves echoing against the hard-packed earth like thunder before a storm. He was a man carved from granite and shadow, with steel-grey eyes that had seen too much death and hands that never trembled when they reached for the twin colts at his hips. The townspeople whispered his name in hushed tones, crossing themselves and pulling their children closer when he passed. They knew the stories. They knew about the 23 men who had drawn against Jack Morrison and found themselves staring up at the desert sky with their last breath rattling in their throats. Morrison hadn't come to Redemption Valley for trouble, but trouble had a way of finding him like iron filings to a magnet. He'd heard tell of a man named Black Pete Garrison who'd been terrorizing the territory, robbing banks and killing lawmen with the cold efficiency of a butcher. The bounty on Garrison's head was substantial enough to fund Morrison's retirement to a quiet ranch somewhere far from the smell of gunpowder. What Morrison hadn't expected was to find Garrison's hideout in the old abandoned church on the hill overlooking the valley. The irony wasn't lost on him that such a godless man would make his sanctuary in the house of the Lord, even one long since abandoned by its congregation. The church stood like a broken promise against the blazing sky, its wooden cross tilted at an angle that suggested either divine abandonment or earthly neglect. Weeds grew through the floorboards, and the pews lay scattered like broken teeth. But it was the perfect place for a man like Garrison to hole up while the law searched for him elsewhere. Morrison had been watching the church for 2 days, noting the patterns of movement, the times when smoke rose from the chimney, the moments when Garrison would step outside to water his horse or empty his bottle. The outlaw was careful, but not careful enough for a hunter of Morrison's caliber. It was on the 3rd evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of blood and gold, that Morrison made his move. He approached the church from the blind side, using the crumbling stone wall of the old cemetery as cover. His boots made no sound on the sandy ground, and his breathing was as controlled as a monk in meditation. The wooden door of the church hung askew on rusted hinges, and Morrison could hear voices from within, not just Garrison's gravelly baritone, but something else, something softer, more melodious. A woman's voice, pleading and desperate, with an accent that spoke of education and refinement rather than frontier hardship. Morrison pressed himself against the wall beside the door and listened. Garrison was drunk, his words slurred and ugly as he spoke to someone Morrison couldn't yet see. The woman's voice came again, trembling but defiant, speaking words that made Morrison's jaw tighten with controlled anger. "Please, I've told you everything I know about my father's business. I don't know where he keeps his money. If you just let me go, I promise I won't tell anyone about this place." "You have my word as a Christian woman." Garrison's laughter was like gravel in a tin can. "Your word? Lady, your word ain't worth the spit it takes to speak it, but you're worth something else entirely. Been a long time since I had me a woman who smelled like roses instead of rot-gut whiskey." Morrison had heard enough. He stepped through the doorway with the fluid grace of a predator, his right hand already hovering over his gun. The scene that greeted him was exactly what he'd expected, and somehow worse than he'd imagined. Black Pete Garrison stood in the center of what had once been the church's nave, a bottle of whiskey in one hand and a length of rope in the other. He was exactly as the wanted posters described him: tall, broad-shouldered, with a black beard streaked with grey and eyes like chips of obsidian. His clothes were expensive but travel-stained, and the pearl handles of his pistols caught the last light filtering through the broken windows. but it was the woman who stole Morrison's breath away. She was bound to one of the remaining pews, her wrists tied with rough hemp that had already rubbed her delicate skin raw. Her dress, once fine blue silk, was torn and dirty from her ordeal, but it couldn't hide the elegant curves beneath, or the aristocratic bearing that even fear couldn't diminish. Her hair was the color of autumn wheat, falling in waves around shoulders that trembled with suppressed terror. Her face was a masterpiece of feminine beauty, with high cheekbones, full lips, and eyes the color of spring violets that held both intelligence and courage despite her desperate situation. Even in her current state, dirty and frightened, she was the most beautiful woman Morrison had ever laid eyes on. There was something about her that reminded him of paintings he'd seen in fancy houses back east, the kind of ethereal beauty that poets wrote sonnets about and men started wars over. "Well, well," Garrison said, his hand moving toward his gun as he spotted Morrison in the doorway. "Looks like we got ourselves some company, darling. You know this here gent?" The woman's eyes met Morrison's across the length of the church, and he saw hope flicker in their violet depths like a candle flame fighting against the wind. She shook her head, never taking her gaze from his face, as if she were trying to read his intentions in the lines around his eyes. "Name's Jack Morrison," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made smart men think twice about their next move. "I'm here for you, Garrison. The woman's got nothing to do with this." Garrison's eyes narrowed as recognition dawned. "Jack Morrison. The Jack Morrison. Well, I'll be damned. Heard you were the fastest gun west of the Mississippi. Heard you never missed and never showed mercy." He took a swig from his bottle and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Also heard you were getting soft in your old age." "Only one way to find out," Morrison replied, his fingers flexing slightly near his holster. "Let the lady go, and we can settle this like men. No need for innocent blood to be spilled today." The woman watched this exchange with wide eyes, her breathing quick and shallow. Morrison could see the intelligence working behind her beautiful features, calculating odds and possibilities like a gambler reading the cards. She knew she was caught between two deadly men, and her survival might depend on the outcome of their confrontation. Garrison laughed and took another drink. "Innocent? This here's Elizabeth Fairfax, daughter of the richest banker in 3 territories. Daddy dearest foreclosed on my family's ranch 5 years ago, left my ma and pa to die in a shack while he counted his money. She's about as innocent as a rattlesnake in a baby's cradle." Morrison's eyes flicked to the woman Elizabeth and saw the truth of it in her face. She was indeed guilty of the sin of wealth, born into privilege, while others suffered. But that didn't make her deserving of whatever Garrison had planned, and Morrison had never been one to let innocent blood flow, regardless of the victim's social standing. "That's between you and her father," Morrison said. "She didn't foreclose on your ranch. She probably didn't even know about it. Let her go, and take your grievance up with the man who actually wronged you." "Oh, but she's gonna help me get my revenge," Garrison said, his eyes glittering with malice. "See, old man Fairfax values his precious daughter above all his gold. He'll pay anything to get her back safe and sound, and if he don't—" He let the threat hang in the air like smoke. Elizabeth finally found her voice, and when she spoke, it was with the cultured tones of Eastern education and the courage of true breeding. "My father will pay whatever ransom you demand, but please don't hurt innocent people. If you have a grievance with him, take it up directly. I've never done anything to harm you or your family." Her voice was like music in the abandoned church, sweet and clear despite her fear. Morrison found himself drawn to her in ways that went beyond mere physical attraction. There was strength in her, a steel core wrapped in silk and refinement that spoke of inner fortitude many frontier men lacked. Garrison's expression turned ugly. "Your family's money came from the sweat and blood of folks like mine. Every fancy dress you wear, every fine meal you eat, every comfort you enjoy was bought with our suffering. You're gonna pay for that debt one way or another." The tension in the church was thick enough to cut with a knife. Morrison could feel the familiar calm that always came over him before violence erupted, the slowing of time and sharpening of focus that had kept him alive through countless gunfights. His hand was steady as stone near his weapon. But it was Elizabeth who broke the standoff in a way that surprised them both. With a fluid motion that spoke of hidden reserves of courage, she rose to her feet despite her bonds and took a step toward Garrison. Her chin was raised defiantly, and her violet eyes blazed with determination. "You want revenge against my family? Fine, take it out on me, but do it like a man, not like a coward who hides behind ropes and threats. If you're going to kill me, look me in the eyes when you do it. Give me that much dignity at least." Morrison felt a surge of admiration for her bravery. Many seasoned gunfighters had faced death with less composure than this refined Eastern lady was showing in her darkest hour. She was magnificent in her defiance, beautiful and terrible as a storm over the mountains. Garrison's face darkened with anger at her challenge to his manhood. His hand moved to his gun, and Morrison tensed, ready to draw. But Elizabeth wasn't finished speaking, and her next words changed everything. "Wait," she said, her voice dropping to something almost intimate. "Before you pull that trigger, consider this. You said you wanted revenge against my family. What better revenge could there be than taking their precious daughter and making her yours, not just as a hostage, but as a wife?" Both men stared at her in shock. Morrison felt something cold twist in his gut at her words, though he couldn't quite name the emotion. Garrison's hand froze halfway to his weapon, his eyes fixed on Elizabeth's face as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "You're talking nonsense, lady," Garrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Fears addled your brain." Elizabeth shook her head, and Morrison could see the calculated intelligence working behind her beautiful features. She was playing for her life with the skill of a professional gambler, using the only cards she had left in the deck. "Think about it," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "My father's fortune would become yours through marriage. You'd have legal claim to everything he's built, everything he's stolen from families like yours, and more than that." She paused, her cheeks coloring slightly with what might have been shame or calculation. Garrison leaned forward, caught despite himself by her words. "More than what?" Elizabeth's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but in the silence of the abandoned church, every word carried clearly. "I'm young, I'm healthy, and I come from strong stock. Don't shoot me. I can give you strong children. Sons who would carry your name and inherit everything my father built. What better revenge could you ask for?" The silence that followed her words was deafening. Morrison felt as if he'd been struck by lightning, every muscle in his body coiled tight as a spring. He'd expected many things when he'd tracked Garrison to this place, but not this. Not watching the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen offer herself to a killer in exchange for her life. Garrison's eyes traveled slowly over Elizabeth's form, taking in every curve hidden beneath the torn silk of her dress. His breathing had grown heavier, and Morrison could see the wheels turning in the outlaw's mind as he considered her proposition. "You'd do that?" Garrison asked, his voice rougher than before. "You'd marry a man like me, bear his children just to save your pretty neck?" Elizabeth's chin rose another inch, and Morrison saw the effort it cost her to maintain her composure. "I'd do whatever it takes to survive, and if that means becoming your wife and the mother of your children, then so be it. But I have conditions." The audacity of it took Morrison's breath away. Here was a woman facing death, offering herself to her captor, and still she was attempting to negotiate terms. There was steel in her spine that many men he'd known would have envied. Garrison laughed, but it was a different kind of laughter now, speculative and hungry. "Conditions? Lady, you ain't exactly in a position to be making demands." "Aren't I?" Elizabeth challenged. "You could kill me right here, right now, and my father would hunt you to the ends of the earth. You'd never have a moment's peace, never be able to spend a single dollar of his money. But if you marry me, if I go willingly and bear your children, he'd have to accept it. He'd have to welcome you into the family, make you his heir. Morrison watched this deadly game of chess play out between them, marveling at Elizabeth's strategic mind, even as something dark and possessive stirred in his chest. The thought of this beautiful, courageous woman in Garrison's brutal hands made him want to draw his guns and end this conversation permanently, but he held himself in check, waiting to see how the scene would play out. Elizabeth had surprised him with her cunning, and he found himself curious to see what other surprises she might have in store. Garrison set down his bottle and took a step closer to Elizabeth, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to look up at him. Morrison's hand twitched toward his gun, but he forced himself to remain still. "What kind of conditions?" Garrison asked, his voice thick with desire and calculation. Elizabeth never flinched, even with the outlaw looming over her like a storm cloud. "First, the marriage has to be legal, a real preacher, witnesses, the whole ceremony. I won't be your whore, Garrison. If I'm going to bear your children, they'll be legitimate heirs, not bastards." Garrison nodded slowly. "Fair enough. What else?" "Second, you leave my father's business alone until after we're married. No more robberies, no more killing. You want to be part of the family fortune. You have to stop destroying it." Morrison saw the wisdom in her strategy. She was buying time, hoping perhaps that her father would find her, or that some opportunity for escape would present itself. But she was also playing a dangerous game with a man who had killed without remorse. "And third," Garrison prompted. Elizabeth's voice grew quieter, more vulnerable, and Morrison saw the mask of composed calculation slip just enough to reveal the frightened young woman beneath. "Third, you treat me with respect. I know what kind of man you are, what you've done. But if I'm going to be your wife, if I'm going to give you children, you have to promise me that much." The request hung in the air between them like a prayer, desperate and fragile. Morrison felt his heart constrict at the courage it must have taken for her to ask for even that small mercy from a man like Garrison. Garrison studied her face for a long moment, and Morrison could see the internal struggle playing out in the outlaw's features. Lust warred with suspicion, greed with caution, and beneath it all, perhaps a flicker of something that might have been genuine feeling. "You're a smart woman, Elizabeth Fairfax," Garrison said finally. "Smarter than I gave you credit for. Most folks in your position would be crying and begging by now." "Would that change anything?" Elizabeth asked. "Would tears and pleas make you show mercy?" Garrison's smile was sharp as a blade. "No, they wouldn't. But your offer, that's got possibilities, real possibilities." He turned to Morrison, as if suddenly remembering the gunfighter's presence. "What do you think, Morrison? Think a fine lady like this could learn to love a rough man like me?" Morrison's voice was carefully neutral when he replied, though every word cost him an effort. "I think a woman will do whatever she has to do to survive. Question is whether you're man enough to deserve what she's offering." The challenge in his words was subtle but unmistakable, and Garrison's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You questioning my manhood, gunfighter? Just observing that it takes a different kind of strength to build something than it does to tear it down," Morrison replied. "Ladies offering you a chance to be more than just another outlaw with a price on his head. Whether you're smart enough to take it, well, that remains to be seen." Elizabeth's eyes flicked between the two men, reading the undercurrents of tension that flowed like electricity through the abandoned church. Morrison could see her mind working, trying to understand the dynamics at play and how she might use them to her advantage. Garrison's hand moved away from his gun, and Morrison saw the exact moment when the outlaw made his decision. It was there in the relaxation of his shoulders, the slight smile that curved his lips, the way his gaze fixed on Elizabeth with something approaching wonder. "All right, darling," Garrison said, reaching out to touch Elizabeth's cheek with surprising gentleness. "You got yourself a deal. I'll marry you proper, make you my wife, give you those strong children you promised." But understand this, once we're wed, there's no going back. You'll be mine completely, in every way a woman can belong to a man." Elizabeth's eyes closed briefly, as if she were steeling herself for what was to come. When she opened them again, they were clear and determined. "I understand, and you understand my conditions." "I do," Garrison nodded. "We'll do this right, legal and proper. Your daddy will have to accept me as his son-in-law, and our children will inherit everything he's built." He turned to Morrison again. "Looks like you made this trip for nothing, gunfighter. No bounty to collect here today." But Morrison's hand was already moving toward his gun, faster than thought, faster than fear. "Actually, Garrison, there's something you should know about deals with the devil." His Colt cleared leather in a blur of motion that was almost too fast for the human eye to follow. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the church like thunder, and Garrison staggered backward, his own weapon only halfway drawn. Elizabeth screamed, more in shock than fear, as Garrison fell to his knees, his hand pressed to the spreading red stain on his chest. His eyes were wide with surprise, and something that might have been respect as he looked up at Morrison. "Why?" Garrison gasped, blood beginning to foam at the corners of his mouth. "She offered. She was willing." Morrison kept his gun trained on the dying outlaw as he spoke, his voice cold as winter wind. "Because some offers shouldn't be accepted, and some prices are too high to pay. She's not a commodity to be bartered with, Garrison. She's a human being, and she deserves better than a life sentence with a killer." Garrison's eyes flicked to Elizabeth, who stood frozen in shock, her face pale as morning frost. "Could have been happy," he whispered, and then the light went out of his eyes forever. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the broken windows and Elizabeth's quick, shallow breathing. Morrison holstered his weapon and turned to face her, uncertain of what he would see in those violet eyes. What he found there surprised him. Not gratitude, not relief, but something that looked almost like anger. Elizabeth straightened to her full height, her chin raised in defiance, and when she spoke, her voice was steady, despite everything she'd just endured. "You had no right," she said quietly. "That was my choice to make, my life to bargain with. Who are you to decide what price is too high for my survival?" Morrison felt as if he'd been slapped. He'd expected thanks, perhaps even tears of relief. He hadn't expected to be challenged by the woman he'd just saved. "Ma'am, I couldn't stand by and watch you sacrifice yourself to a killer. No woman should have to make that kind of choice." "But it was my choice to make," Elizabeth insisted, stepping closer to him. "You don't know me, don't know my circumstances. Maybe I would have been willing to honor that bargain. Maybe I would have found a way to make it work, to build something good from something terrible. You took that possibility away from me." Morrison found himself speechless in the face of her anger. She was magnificent in her fury, her eyes blazing with indignation and her whole body vibrating with contained emotion. He'd never met a woman who challenged him so directly, so fearlessly. "I'm sorry," he said finally, and meant it. "I thought I was helping." Elizabeth's expression softened slightly at his obvious sincerity. "I know you meant well, and I suppose I should thank you for saving my life. It's just—" She paused, looking down at Garrison's body. "He wasn't entirely wrong about my father. Our family's wealth was built on the suffering of others. Maybe I deserved whatever fate awaited me." "No," Morrison said firmly. "Whatever your family's sins, they're not yours to bear. And no woman deserves what Garrison had planned for you, regardless of her circumstances." Elizabeth looked up at him then, really seeing him for the first time. Morrison felt exposed under her gaze, as if she were looking past the gunfighter's reputation to the man beneath. What she saw there seemed to surprise her. "You're not what I expected," she said softly. "When you walked through that door, I thought you were just another killer. But there's something different about you, isn't there? Something honorable." Morrison felt heat rise in his cheeks at her words. It had been a long time since anyone had called him honorable, and coming from this extraordinary woman, the compliment meant more than he cared to admit. "I try to be," he said simply. In a world full of men like Garrison, somebody has to stand for what's right. Elizabeth nodded slowly, understanding passing between them like a bridge built in the space of a heartbeat. Morrison found himself drowning in her violet eyes, losing himself in the intelligence and strength he saw there. "What happens now?" she asked, glancing again at Garrison's body. "People will ask questions when they find him. They'll want to know what happened here." Morrison considered this. Garrison was wanted dead or alive. His death will be seen as justice served, nothing more. As for what happened between you two, he met her eyes. That's between us. No one else needs to know about the bargain you offered. Relief flickered across Elizabeth's features. Thank you. That kind of story. It would ruin my reputation, make it impossible for me to return to normal life. Your secret's safe with me, Morrison assured her. He moved to untie her bonds, his fingers gentle as he worked at the rough hemp that had rubbed her wrists raw. The touch of her skin against his sent electricity shooting through his veins, and he had to force himself to concentrate on the task at hand. When she was free, Elizabeth rubbed her wrists and looked around the abandoned church with new eyes. "It's strange," she mused. "A few minutes ago, this place was a prison. Now it feels almost sacred, like something important happened here." Morrison understood what she meant. Something had changed between them in this place, something that went beyond the circumstances of their meeting. He felt it too, a connection that transcended the typical relationship between rescuer and rescued. "Where will you go now?" he asked, though part of him already dreaded her answer. A woman like Elizabeth Fairfax belonged in drawing rooms and ballrooms, not riding dusty trails with a gunfighter whose hands were stained with blood. "Back to my father, I suppose," she said, but there was little enthusiasm in her voice. "Back to the life I was born to live, tea parties and charity events, and finding a suitable husband from an approved list of acceptable suitors." The bitterness in her voice surprised Morrison. "That doesn't sound like something you're looking forward to." Elizabeth laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You know what the terrible irony is? In offering myself to Garrison, I felt more alive, more in control of my destiny than I have in years of following society's expectations. At least that bargain would have been my choice, even if it was a horrible one." Morrison felt something shift inside his chest, a dangerous hope that he tried to push down before it could take root. "It doesn't have to be that way. You could choose a different path." "Could I?" Elizabeth asked, turning to face him fully. "What kind of different path?" "I'm a banker's daughter, Mr. Morrison. I have duties, responsibilities, expectations to fulfill. I can't just disappear into the sunset like some character in a dime novel." "Why not?" Morrison challenged. "You're intelligent, brave, and stronger than most men I've known. You could do anything you set your mind to. The only chains holding you are the ones you allow others to put on you." Elizabeth stared at him for a long moment, and Morrison could see the war playing out in her expressive features. Duty battled with desire, propriety with possibility, and for just a moment he thought he saw which side might win. But then she shook her head, and the moment passed. "It's not that simple. People depend on me, expect things from me. I can't just abandon my responsibilities because I want something different." Morrison nodded, understanding even as his heart sank. He'd known it was impossible from the beginning, but for just a moment he'd allowed himself to hope for something he'd never thought he could have. "I'll escort you back to town," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Make sure you get safely back to your father." "Thank you," Elizabeth said softly. "That's very kind of you." They gathered what few belongings Elizabeth had with her and prepared to leave the abandoned church. As they stepped out into the fading daylight, Morrison helped her mount Garrison's horse, trying not to notice how perfectly she fit against him when he lifted her into the saddle. The ride back to Redemption Valley was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The desert landscape stretched endlessly around them, painted in shades of gold and crimson by the setting sun. It was beautiful in its starkness, Morrison thought, like the woman riding beside him, beautiful but untouchable. As they crested the hill overlooking the town, Elizabeth broke the silence. "Mr. Morrison, may I ask you something?" "Of course. When you shot Garrison, you said some offers shouldn't be accepted. Did you mean that, or were you just trying to justify what you'd done?" Morrison considered his answer carefully. "I meant it. Some prices are too high to pay, no matter what you get in return. Your freedom, your dignity, your right to choose your own path, those things are worth more than survival at any cost." Elizabeth was quiet for so long that Morrison began to think she wouldn't respond. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "What if I told you that I've been paying prices like that my whole life? What if I told you that marrying Garrison might have been the first truly free choice I've ever been able to make?" The pain in her voice hit Morrison like a physical blow. He pulled his horse to a stop and turned to face her, seeing the tears she was trying so hard not to shed. "Then I'd say it's time you started making different choices," he said gently. "Real choices, ones that honor who you are instead of what others expect you to be." Elizabeth wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks in the dust on her cheeks. "And if I don't know who I am anymore, if I've been playing a role for so long that I've forgotten what's underneath?" "Then you find out," Morrison said simply. "You peel away the layers until you get to the truth. It might be scary, and it might not be what others want to see, but at least it'll be yours." They continued toward town in contemplative silence, each lost in thoughts of possibilities and paths not taken. As they reached the outskirts of Redemption Valley, Morrison could see people beginning to gather, drawn by the sight of the banker's daughter returning after her ordeal. "This is where we part ways, isn't it?" Elizabeth asked, and Morrison heard something like regret in her voice. "I suppose it is," he replied, though every instinct in his body screamed against leaving her. "Your father will want to get you home safely, and I need to collect the bounty on Garrison." Elizabeth nodded, but she made no move to dismount or ride toward the crowd of townspeople gathering to greet her. Instead, she sat her horse and studied Morrison's face as if she were trying to memorize every detail. "Mr. Morrison," she said finally, "hypothetically speaking, if a woman wanted to disappear from her old life and start fresh somewhere new, how would she go about it?" Morrison's heart began to beat faster, but he kept his voice steady. "Hypothetically, she'd need money, a new identity, and the courage to leave everything familiar behind. She'd also need someone she could trust to help her make the transition. And if she had all those things, then she'd be free to become whoever she wanted to be." Elizabeth smiled then, the first genuine smile Morrison had seen from her, and it transformed her entire face. She was beautiful before, but smiling she was radiant. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison, for everything." She began to ride toward the crowd, then stopped and looked back over her shoulder. "Oh, and Mr. Morrison, my friends call me Beth." With that, she spurred her horse forward and rode into the arms of her relieved father and the safety of her old life. Morrison watched her go, his heart heavy with the weight of missed opportunities and roads not taken. But as he turned his own horse toward the sheriff's office to collect his bounty, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of their story. Something in the way she'd said goodbye, the question about disappearing, the way she'd told him her friends called her Beth, suggested that Elizabeth Fairfax might not be as resigned to her fate as she appeared. 3 days later, as Morrison prepared to leave Redemption Valley with Garrison's bounty burning a hole in his saddlebags, he found a note slipped under his hotel room door. It was written on expensive paper in an elegant feminine hand, and it contained only a few lines. "Dear Mr. Morrison, I find myself in need of a guide for a journey to California. I leave tomorrow at dawn from the old church. If you happen to be riding that way, I would welcome the company. Your friend, Beth." Morrison read the note 3 times before it fully sank in. Then he began to smile, an expression that transformed his weathered features and made him look years younger. Elizabeth Fairfax had made her choice after all, and it was exactly the kind of choice he'd hoped she would make. At dawn the next morning, Morrison rode up to the abandoned church to find Beth waiting for him. She was dressed in practical traveling clothes, her hair braided back in a simple style, and she had a pack horse loaded with supplies. But it was the expression on her face that took his breath away, radiant with joy and anticipation, alive with the promise of freedom. "I was hoping you'd come," she said as he approached. "Wouldn't miss it for the world," Morrison replied. "Ready to find out who Beth is underneath all those expectations?" "More ready than I've ever been for anything in my life," she said, and Morrison could hear the truth of it in her voice. They rode west together as the sun climbed higher in the sky, two souls who had found something precious in the most unlikely of circumstances. Behind them, Redemption Valley grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely, taking with it Elizabeth Fairfax and all the limitations that name implied. Ahead lay California and 1,000 possibilities, adventures yet to be written in the story of two hearts that had recognized something kindred in each other. Morrison had thought he was hunting a bounty when he tracked Garrison to that abandoned church, but instead he'd found something far more valuable. He'd found love, and Beth had found her freedom. In the end, that was worth more than all the gold in her father's bank, more than all the bounties in the territory. It was worth everything they'd both given up to have it. As they disappeared into the vastness of the western frontier, the wind seemed to carry the echo of Elizabeth's desperate bargain with Garrison. "Don't shoot! I can give you strong children," she had pleaded. But in the end, she had chosen to give those children to a better man, in a better life, built on love rather than fear. And in the growing legend of Jack Morrison and the mysterious woman who rode beside him, the people of the frontier would speak of the gunfighter who'd found something worth more than his reputation, and the banker's daughter who'd chosen love over luxury, freedom over security, and an uncertain future over a predetermined fate. What do you think drove Elizabeth to make such a dramatic choice? Was she truly ready to honor her bargain with Garrison, or was it all an elaborate bluff? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know what you think really motivated this remarkable woman to risk everything for a chance at freedom.